Could a spinning razor-sharp hat actually slice someone in half? Kung Lao makes it look effortless. In this video, we'll test his iconic weapon through 4 lenses: the lore it comes from, the real physics of flight, the challenge of materials, and the impossible return and catch. Leave your like, subscribe, and let's get into the science of Mortal Kombat. Kung Lao's razor-rimmed hat isn't just a flashy accessory. It has a firm place in Mortal Kombat canon. His hat and fighting style made their debut in Mortal Kombat 2, where it was introduced not only as a weapon, but as a relic passed down through the Shaolin tradition. The games repeatedly describe it as unique, inseparable from Kung Lao's identity, and even tied to his legacy across alternate timelines. From the very beginning, it stood out as more than a piece of gear. It was meant to be something almost sacred, embodying both his martial arts skill and the mystical side of the series. In the lore, the razor-rimmed hat is said to be crafted from a highly secret Shaolin recipe for metal. That single phrase explains why its edge never dulls, why it withstands impossible levels of stress, and why no opponent ever manages to break it. The narrative leans on this idea of a mysterious alloy to answer questions before they're asked. How can a weapon endure battles where most real metals would warp, crack, or blunt? The in-universe answer is simple. It's built of something no one else can forge. That makes the hat both indestructible and irreplaceable, elevating it from a tool of combat to a symbol of tradition. Visually, players quickly recognize that the weapon defines Kung Lao's style. Rather than relying on fists alone, he uses the hat as a projectile, a shield, and even as a trap. In canon, the hat boomerangs back to him after a throw, orbits around his body like a spinning barrier, and even teleports into his hands mid-fight. Across the franchise, his movesets consistently expand these abilities, letting the hat hover in place as a deadly snare, or spin so quickly in his hands that it becomes a close-range shredder. Though each game iteration introduces new variations, the hat is always described as supernatural in its behavior, which makes sense. It's not bound by normal physics, it's bound by the rules of Mortal Kombat's world. The look and feel of the hat didn't materialize out of nowhere. Mortal Kombat's creators have openly credited the design to Oddjob's deadly bowler hat in Goldfinger. In that film, Oddjob uses a steel-brimmed bowler like a weapon, throwing it with such precision that it slices through statues and threatens Bond himself. That small but unforgettable gimmick stuck in pop culture, and co-creator John Tobias has acknowledged it as a direct influence. Turning that cinematic oddity into a recurring central weapon gave Kung Lao immediate visual punch, and over time, the idea evolved into something entirely its own. From homage to hallmark, the razor-rimmed hat shifted from being a clever nod to cinema into the cornerstone of a lasting video game identity. Within the story, the hat also symbolizes lineage. Kung Lao isn't just another fighter. He's depicted as carrying the legacy of past warriors, and the hat serves as evidence of that inheritance. It's both a weapon and a reminder of his role in the larger Mortal Kombat universe. Over the years, cutscenes and dialogue often highlight the hat as a marker of who he is, suggesting that it belongs to the character's bloodline as much as to the Shaolin Order. Even fans often note that the weapon has almost as much personality as the fighter himself, with many pointing out how his most memorable moments are tied directly to the hat. Taken together, the lore makes the razor-rimmed hat less of a gadget and more of a sacred, multifunctional relic. It flies, it returns, it shields, it traps, and it never breaks. As an in-universe object, the hat is already explained away by mysticism and secret metallurgy, which frees the story from having to address the limits of real-world mechanics. That's the reason the games can consistently show it slicing through opponents' bones while landing flawlessly back on Kung Lao. But leaving the myth aside for a moment, what about the physics of actually tossing something like this? If you had a circular blade sharp enough to cut and tried to throw it the way Kung Lao does, how far would science let you take it? When it comes to what happens after the throw, the real challenge is not the sharpness, but physics. To understand the hurdles, let's look at the basic principles of a frisbee's flight. The disc's stability comes mainly from spin, a property known as gyroscopic stability. The faster it spins, the more it resists wobbling off its intended path. Add to that the curved profile of a frisbee, which helps generate a small amount of lift, and you have a disc that sails smoothly instead of tumbling like a plate. Without spin, it crashes quickly. With it, the disc can ride a line of airflow while balancing drag and lift. That system falls apart when you sharpen the rim. Frisbees work because they have a broad, rounded edge that air can flow around steadily. A much thinner edge, like the razor rim Kung Lao's hat suggests, would likely make the disc less stable, disrupt airflow, and increase turbulence. Instead of gliding, it would wobble more and lose distance. The irony is clear. The sharp edge that makes the weapon look lethal in lore would undercut the very aerodynamics that allow smooth flight. This is why no disc sport on Earth relies on blades. The penalty to control and range is simply too high. His feats imply much greater acceleration and energy input than biomechanics can provide. That's why part of the move feels otherworldly. It literally is. Then there's impact energy. If the hat weighs, say, 5 pounds, and Kung Lao throws it at 60 miles per hour, that's about 1,100 to 1,500 joules of kinetic energy. For comparison, that's in the same ballpark as a 9mm handgun round. Dangerous? Absolutely, but not nearly enough to slice a body cleanly in half, which would require thousands of newtons of cutting force just to get through bone. Realistically, you could injure a target by throwing a sharpened disc, but you would not get the clean, effortless bisects that the game portrays unless you added mechanical launching systems or supernatural assistance. The hat's cinematic lethality belongs to Mortal Kombat's world, not ours. That raises another major obstacle. Flight physics is one side of the issue, but durability and structure are the other. A weapon like this would need to be both light enough to throw and strong enough to survive high-speed impacts without shattering. That balance comes down to the metal itself, and in lore, it's explained away as a secret Shaolin alloy with mystical durability. What would it actually take in real-world material science to build something close? Canon explanation: a secret Shaolin alloy. That's the franchise's built-in answer for why Kung Lao's razor-rimmed hat never dulls, never bends, and never breaks. In the Mortal Kombat universe, that single phrase accounts for the weapon's impossible survivability. Stripped of the fantasy, though, the dilemma is straightforward. A flying disc that is light enough to stay airborne is rarely strong enough to cut and survive impact, while metal sturdy enough to slice or endure collisions are usually too heavy to throw effectively. That contradiction is the core of what we can call the secret Shaolin metal recipe problem. Weapons through history have always faced a balance between hardness and toughness. Too much hardness makes edges prone to snapping, while too much softness leaves them unable to hold a sharp rim. Blacksmiths spent centuries finding middle ground, layering steels, practicing complex quenching techniques, and optimizing thickness. But those solutions assumed a weapon held in the hand. None were designed to function as a bladed discus, hurled with spin and expected to slice through dense materials on impact, while also surviving a return trip to a fighter's head. The physics demands on such a weapon exceed both historical craftsmanship and modern engineering. A katana, for example, can reach 60 Rockwell hardness, enough to hold a razor edge but can still chip against bone. Aerospace alloys, like titanium, are tougher, but making a 2-foot disc out of titanium would push the weight around 4 kilograms or 9 pounds, too heavy to throw like a frisbee. Historically, the closest parallel to the hat comes from the chakram in South Asia, thin metal throwing rings about 6 to 12 inches across and weighing only 150 to 300 grams. They could wound, but nothing close to bisecting someone. Kung Lao's hat, often depicted as 2 feet wide and several pounds heavy, takes that modest weapon and exaggerates it by an order of magnitude. And to actually cleave a torso, studies of bone fracture thresholds suggest you'd need 2,500 to 4,000 newtons of cutting force. A thrown object might generate 300 to 600 newtons at best. That's a massive shortfall, and exactly why the story leans on Shaolin metallurgy as a hand wave. There's also the often overlooked issue: safety for the user. Wearing a razor-edged brim close to your face would be hazardous even if it never left your head. Any sudden movement, slip, or impact could cause injury before the hat was even thrown. If made sharp enough to slice bone, it would be too dangerous to touch, let alone catch in motion. So what does the secret Shaolin recipe really mean for us? It functions exactly as a narrative shortcut. It closes the gaps engineers could never bridge in the real world, balancing flight, lethality, toughness, and safety. Without that hand wave, the weapon collapses under its own contradictions. That's why the razor-rimmed hat remains firmly in the realm of fiction. Even if some miracle metal existed that could combine all these attributes, the practical challenge of using, throwing, and retrieving such a weapon would still be unsolvable. And that brings us to the final obstacle. How could anyone throw a spinning blade and then catch it with their bare hands, unharmed? When we shift focus from the throw to the retrieval, we arrive at the most unrealistic feature of all, the impossible return and catch. Mortal Kombat makes it look effortless. Across multiple game entries, the hat either curves back, snaps instantly into Kung Lao's hands, or even teleports back when needed. Canon treats this ability as a given. It's not explained through physics, but rather as part of the hat's supernatural qualities. Unlike a boomerang, the hat's flat circular profile and sharpened rim are not shaped to naturally curve through the air and come back. Frisbees can glide on a straight path, and boomerangs can circle because of their asymmetric design. But a razor-edged disc shaped like Kung Lao's hat simply doesn't have the geometry for a true self-return. The games show it anyway, because this is where fiction steps in. What audiences see is a magical recall effect, not an aerodynamic trick. Even so, some fans have tried to imagine ways it might work without invoking magic. One popular explanation discussed on Reddit proposes that the hat has two structural layers, an inner spinning plate that handles stability, and a collapsible or retractable blade system. In this theory, the edges could contract temporarily, letting the hat pass safely through a target, and then re-expand once free. Others suggest the rim itself could rotate independently, decreasing friction on the wielder's hands during the catch. These are entertaining ideas that treat the weapon almost like a piece of advanced engineering, rather than something rooted in mysticism. The contrast becomes clearer if we look at actual examples of return weapons. Real boomerangs are light, asymmetrical strips of wood designed only to circle back. They're safe enough to catch with training and often require padding or gloves. Now replace wood with sharpened steel, enlarge the dimensions, and remove the curved wings that make it turn in flight. You end up with an object guaranteed not to return on its own. In combat, that makes it nothing more than a one-time throw until retrieved manually. The design Kung Lao uses also raises the question of human reaction. A spinning, razor-sharp disc coming back even moderately fast is not something the body can handle safely. Hand surfaces aren't resistant enough, and small errors lead to severe damage. The lore answers this by saying the weapon is bound to Kung Lao, returning to him under his control rather than obeying conditions of physics. That's why in animation, he can casually extend a hand while his blade drops seamlessly into it, because in universe, the return is less an act of catching and more an act of recall. It's worth noting that Mortal Kombat's inspiration nods to Oddjob's throwing hat and Goldfinger, but while the movie weapon worked as a striking gimmick, it was not designed to return on its own. On-screen props only needed to imply deadliness, whereas the games layer on supernatural functions that far exceed pop culture's earlier versions. That element of teleportation or automatic return is unique to the lore, and it's the key reason this design only functions in fiction. The return and catch are the clearest example of why Kung Lao's weapon can't exist outside the game. Materials and physics might get you a sharp flying disc, but no science explains how to consistently recall and catch it unharmed. That piece belongs solidly to Mortal Kombat's rulebook, not ours. And it's exactly here that the contrast between fantasy and reality becomes undeniable, setting up the larger takeaway. What works seamlessly inside the game falls apart under the rules that bind our world. In Mortal Kombat, the razor-rimmed hat works because the franchise gifts it supernatural attributes and a secret Shaolin alloy that guarantees it never fails. In the real world, though, the mix of flight, cutting power, and safe return creates conflicting requirements that no material or aerodynamic design can solve without either magic or heavy engineering. Remember, MK sources make this explicit, describing the hat as a relic forged from a secret Shaolin recipe, and showing it teleporting or boomeranging back, fiction filling in all the impossible gaps. So here's a thought experiment. How would you engineer a safe returning disc? Which explanation feels stronger to you? The canon alloy, fan engineering hacks like a dual rim, or imagining it as a disguised drone? Tell us below, and if you enjoyed this mix of lore and science, be sure to like and subscribe for more.